Thank you, Johan, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll thank you in the beginning in case I forget to thank you at the end. Can you all understand me? Okay, so a bit like Dani, as I get more excited I probably speak more quickly and more loudly, but I'd say at the outset, like Dani, like Lorenz before him, if we all have a passion for what we do, we tend to work better, have greater success. And what we do in science is not unlike what Dani just explained on his farm. And it's farmers like Dani that inspire us to work harder and work better. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about a program that's probably been a 30-year program, and it's involved developing legumes such that our farmers could farm with lower risk. I'll mention free nitrogen farming, which was a term we coined to explain to farmers that they could get nitrogen freely from the air by growing legumes rather than buying fertilisers. We'll be talking about Rhizobia, which is the bacteria that fixes nitrogen with legumes. I'm going to introduce briefly a concept of summer sowing, but Brad's going to spend quite some time talking about that, and then I'll finish off, if I don't run out of time, about the legumes of the future. So here we go. Oh yes, so we start with the two most important biological processes on the planet. That's photosynthesis, where the leaves take in carbon dioxide powered by the sun and produce sugars. That's the most important biological process on the planet. And the second one is nitrogen fixation, because without this process, the planet would never have ever had enough nitrogen to grow crops in the early days. Nitrogen fixation is the process whereby nitrogen gas, which is inert, is taken up by the nodule, which is formed by the plant, and inside the nodule, the bacteria breaks the triple bond that holds nitrogen gas together and turns it into proteins, and the proteins then, of course, go up to other parts of the plant. And so Professor Lal in the first video talked about the bioengine. Well, this is the fuel of the bioengine in my view, nitrogen fixation. So they're the two processes that allow us to grow legumes and other crops. Nitrogen, of course, is essential for plant growth. Without it, we don't get very far. And this is some of the work that Johan mentioned on Christmas Island, where we're introducing agriculture on old mine sites where the soil was removed for phosphate mining, rock phosphate. And what's left behind is soil that contains very little carbon, very little nitrogen. So this is maize and millet without nitrogen, and this is the response to about 60 units of nitrogen. It's the most infertile soils I've ever encountered, but it's great for us to do our science. And so nitrogen is critical, it's often limiting, and in our farming systems it's very expensive. So if we can encourage a lower usage of fertiliser nitrogen, that's okay. Now leave it there, I might fall off. As Professor Lal said, there's a direct cost in using nitrogen, but there's an indirect cost in the carbon that it takes to form the nitrogen in the Haber-Bosch process. So I guess our life is about developing ways farmers can reduce their reliance on fertiliser nitrogen. And that has been by the development of well-adapted legumes and their rhizobia. And because we're in Western Australia, it looks a lot like Gideon's farm up in the north of the Swartland, infertile soils, and there's not many legumes you can pull off the shelf and grow there, so we had to develop our own, basically. And these are just some pictures of legumes which you already know about. That's crimson clover, and these are the nodules on Bisalrula. But the key to it all, none of this works without the bacteria in the nodules, and that's an electron micrograph of a Rhizobium cell, and that's what most of my group work on, the Rhizobia. And if you culture Rhizobia in the laboratory, the colonies can grow and look like this, and this is the organism that's pushing up the nitrogen in the medics on your research plots, Johan, and on the great medic pastures that we saw yesterday. It's this strain, in fact, that we developed to enable the polymorphomedics to grow on acid soils. So, about 25 years ago, we started working on new pastures for farming systems. And I'm going to talk about, briefly, I'll introduce our West Australian farming systems. I'm going to tell you why legumes are falling out of our rotations, why some legumes are becoming harder and harder to grow. And those reasons are based around soil acidification. It's hard for us to lime our soils. The increased use of herbicides, the intensification of cropping systems, the poor returns on the animal industries over the last couple of decades, and that's all based around economics. I'll talk to you about the new pasture types that we felt we needed to develop to overcome this. We had to develop some new inoculation systems to develop the systems that Brad will talk to you about. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time just emphasising the emerging facts on how the residues of the selective herbicides we're using are one of the greatest dangers to sustainable nitrogen fixation from legumes. So that's what I hope to tell you in the next half an hour. Where's Johan? He's gone. Someone needs to let me know when I've got 10 minutes to go, please. So that's Western Australia. Here's Australia, here's Western Australia. The bit we farm is, or the wheat belt, if you drove it, it's about 1,300 kilometres from the top of the wheat belt to the bottom. And in here is where we do most of our legume development. The rainfall there varies from 200 to 600, or 600 millimetres here, about 400 over here. Hot, dry summers, coarse soils. In here there's about 13 million hectares of arable land. In any given year about 40% is in pasture and 60% is in crop. Don't know why that reversed itself, but it's 60% crop, 40% pasture. The pasture composition varies from 0% legume to about 90% legume, and I'll show you some pictures of that. The grain yields vary from 1 to 3 tonnes per hectare. 1 would be a lupin crop, 3 might be a better wheat crop, canola might be in between. We export about, or we harvest from here about 12 to 18 million tonnes of grain every year, and we export about 70% of it, and we run about 20 million sheep in there. So that's a rough sketch of Western Australia, but a lot of it looks like the area we drove around in the last few days. Well, actually, I wished it looked like that. I wished we had the mountains, but it's a bit flat and there's no mountains and the soils look the same. So you're very lucky here to farm in those magnificent panoramic landscapes. It's the best in the world that I've ever seen. It's just like Brad said, it's like a fairyland. That's what it feels like. But Western Australia is not. It's flat and hot and dusty. We have some farming systems. We have this ley farming system that you've probably heard about, where our farmers do rotate a crop with a legume pasture if they're lucky, but often the pasture doesn't have legumes in it, and it might be wheat pasture, barley pasture, something like that. We have a group of farmers in the north that just have a wheat lupin rotation, and then we have a group of farmers, maybe 20%, that just crop and don't have any pastures, and they don't really have many legumes. And I'm going to talk about why they don't. If you listen hard, you'll understand why they don't. Okay, we did recognise 40 years ago that we needed crop legumes, cash crops, and we domesticated the lupin. A guy called John Gladstones, who lectured to me at university, bred the lupin. Well, he domesticated the narrow-leaf lupin. In about 1980, this blue line is lupin sowings. We started to get them into cropping systems. By mid-1990s, we had 1.6 million hectares per year of lupins, and then they crashed. They've been taken over now by canola. And canola's going up here, lupins are hanging around here, which was a shame. You know, we found a legume, we domesticated, we made it non-shattering, we took the alkaloids out, we learned how to harvest it, and we did all that good stuff, and then we find we can't use it as much as we want to. Why not? Mainly because we can't control the weeds. So we've come to a point 30 years on where we've used so many different herbicides, the weeds now have multiple herbicide resistance. So that's a primary reason we can't grow lupins anymore. So there's one warning note to you. And we are 95% minimum tillage, by the way, have been for 25 years. The other problems with lupin is, in the marketplace, it's a feed, not a food, so you get a discounted price. You can't charge the $500, $600 a tonne that you get for foods. Farmers will pay $200 or $300 for feed. And the other problem is, the cereal yield you get, the boost in yield you get following lupins and legumes, it's not that highly valued by our farmers anymore. So that's an extension communication problem. It's not well quantified anymore, the boost you get in rotational systems. So the textbooks had some numbers many years ago, but in our systems it's not well quantified. And as we're finding with canola, the yield boost after canola is very, very akin to the yield boost after legumes. So the reasons for growing legumes have diminished. But the critical one for the lack of lupins is how difficult it is to control weeds in them. So you sit there and you say, well, grow something else. And you guys you're lucky, you can. We can't. We've tried them all. Oh, sorry. Too many buttons. We've tried them all. We tried your faba beans, we call them failure beans, chickpeas, the lentils, the peas, many vicious species. We don't have soils that are good enough for them. You guys do, that we saw the last few days, so you're lucky. You've got legume options. We don't. And that's why we started working on the pasture legumes. I digress here to wake you up. I have to talk a little bit about some theories that we developed. We spend time on the Cocos and Christmas Islands. That's what they look like from there. That's my colleague, Ron Yates. He surfs a lot, and there's a very good surf break here. I tried to surf, and I do surf, but that was my last exercise there on Cocos Island. But on Cocos Island, we were asked to try and grow food, like we have been on Christmas Island, and I thought this is easy. 26 degrees, poor soils, rains every day, it's hot, and all the great legume scientists of the world had delivered all those beautiful legumes that would be able to grow here. Beans, cowpeas, pigeon pea, the other beans, soybeans. I just took them all over and thought this will be easy, and guess what? Nothing grew except lablab purpureum, or Dolichos lablab, which got me thinking about soil infertility and legumes, because this was quite a shock. These rows here are lablab, and Ron's looking a bit confused. Why does only lablab grow? And anyway, as we went along, it dawned on me that most of these crop legumes we've developed are no good on coarse textured infertile soils. And in fact, most of them require high fertility. So in the subtropics, in my view, and I think this is substantiated now, I've developed this index of the level of fertility of the soil required by the different legumes. So Phaseolus needs fantastic soils. Soybean, I think, needs pretty good soils. Mung bean also. Cowpea's not too bad in its adaptation to, let's say, coarse textured soils. I'll use the word infertile, and I mean decreasing levels of clay, decreasing levels of pH, decreasing potassium. Cowpeas are not too bad. Lab's fantastic. In the Mediterranean systems, lentils, we can't grow them at all. Favour beans, chickpeas are not too bad. Albus lupins can tolerate a bit of infertility. Peas are probably the best of our normal pulse crops for infertility, and the narrow-leaf lupin is very, very good. So this is my fertility index and how I explain that most of the legumes that people eat require good soils, but most of the poor farmers in the world have poor soils. So I think we've done a big disservice to farmers that have lousy soils. And of course, along the way, you have to realise that the cereals are fantastically adapted to many soil types. They're broadly adapted. Wheat grows anywhere, barley grows anywhere, as does maize. So the point here is that whilst the textbooks will tell you legumes are great for infertile soils, you open any textbook on agriculture and there'll be a line in there somewhere about legumes in infertile soils. It's not really true, because the legumes we've domesticated generally require fertile soils. There's 19,000 legumes on the planet, and there's plenty that'll grow on infertile soils, but the ones we have domesticated, the ones we eat, like fertile soils. So there's a gap in our breeding programs, in my view. Well, that was just a little bit of a diversion from the pasture legume science that we do. In about 1993, we had the chance to develop a new program that would allow us to look for better adapted legumes, pasture legumes for our soils. These are the sort of innovation technologies that Professor Lowell mentioned in the video. The innovation to us was being innovative around what legumes might be available for domestication. So we defined 7 or 8 attributes that we thought were lacking in our legumes, our pasture legumes, and we wanted to correct this. We wanted legumes that were easy to harvest and process. Pasture legumes I'm talking about. Brad will probably explain why, but in our systems, if you can't obtain inexpensive seed, you don't improve your pastures. So we only had available to us plants like some of the medics and subclover, and the seed was too expensive to really use. We wanted legumes that were deep-rooted, longer growing, but also more resilient of occasional drought, and we needed tolerance to acid and infertile soils in both the plant and the bacteria. RNB is root nodule bacteria. So we needed to select Rhizobia that could survive in the soils that the legumes were going to be used upon. We needed high levels of seed production, tolerance to pests and diseases, suitability to grazing systems, and we needed these seeds to be hard such that they could form a dormant seed bank. So we set about developing new pasture legumes, a little bit like Darnie set about saying he wanted 4 crops in 3 years. What was he going to do? We sort of took the blinkers off and said we need different sorts of legumes for different soil types and different farming systems. So that was our sort of Bible in 1993. And the farming systems that we were targeting were not only the year in, year out systems, cereal pasture, but our farmers were increasingly moving to longer gaps between the pasture phase, so 2 crops, then a pasture, and 3 crops, then a pasture. So we had to develop pasture legumes that could be sown here, go through 3 crops and be sprayed out, and regenerate, self-regenerate. So this is a key word to understand. In our thinking, we only want to sow the legumes and the rhizobia once every 20 years, but they have to grow when we want them. And we call this legumes on demand. Okay, so we're asking a lot. We're asking a lot, but our farmers are stingy bastards and they won't buy seed every year they want a legume. Well, certainly not the ones in Western Australia where things are tough. Okay, so that concept of getting the plant to set seed, the seed will sit in the soil, and regenerate when we need it is what Brad's going to talk to you in some detail about. Now, of course, in this system, there's a wide use of herbicides to control the weeds in the cash crops, because we've got to get them clean, as you guys do. Hello, Peter. Good to see you there. Right, so, now, I'm not sure why I put this picture in, but it's important for you guys to know that in Australia, everything we farm has come from somewhere else. None of our native plants are any good for eating or farming, so we had to introduce everything. We have an interesting set of legumes, but they're either not tolerant of grazing or they're toxic to animals. So there is no single plant in Australia that's been developed for agriculture, except maybe the macadamia nut. So we rely on what's coming in. What we developed for the first 200 years after Europeans got there were annual systems that came by accident, annual legumes that came really by accident in these ships. So the question we put to ourselves, we're farming plants that got here by accident. Surely there's something out there that if we go and look hard at, we might be able to introduce to do better. So that was the sort of the philosophy. We have this exploration of the world's botanical gardens philosophy. Let's go and find out what's good. So someone had to do that, and this is my story, Dani. You had your story, so this is mine. We started collecting legumes and rhizobia from the Mediterranean regions of the world that have acid soils, right? So this is Morocco, this is Syria, these are the Greek islands, this is Sardinia, that's Syria and Iraq. And through that process, we managed to bring back a whole heap of different hard-seeded annual legumes that had those 8 characteristics that I mentioned. Here's just some pictures of them, and this is mainly Brad's work. I'm not sure that he'll tell you how good his program was, so I'm going to tell you because he'll be too reserved to tell you that this was all his work. But Brad was in charge of domesticating and breeding lots of these new plants, and now about 65% of pastures sown in Western Australia come from this program, and mainly the Ceredellas, some of the Clovers. This is yellow Ceredella, but Brad will talk to you about pink Ceredella. This is gland clover, I think that Peter had a paddock of a few years ago. And these are some of the aerial seeding clovers. This is bladder clover. And the aerial seeding was important to us because it allowed us to harvest them with our cereal headers. Because up until this point, all of our legumes were harvested with suction harvesters, which actually destroy the soil surface to get the seed up, and the soil blows away like the pictures we saw from Dani. And we didn't think we'd ever be able to be allowed to keep harvesting plants like that, ruining soils. So one of our philosophies, as I said, was these aerial seeding plants that hold onto their seed that we can harvest and spread around. And we did that. And of course, as I said, as a rhizobiologist, I have to emphasise the importance of the Rhizobium program, and here's just an example of introduction of some of the clovers into some of our field sites where you get the inoculant right or you get the inoculant wrong. You need specific inoculants for some of these legumes, and if you get it wrong, this is chickpeas at Kununurra, but if you get it wrong, you don't get nitrogen fixation and you don't get the benefits of the legume, obviously. And it's particularly important in our systems because our soils are quite hostile to many of the microbes, and we have to select really well adapted strains that can survive in these soils through all those wheat crops. So they have to survive as saprophytes and be there to nodulate the legume when we want it to grow. So not only legumes on demand, but Rhizobium on demand. We had the occasional failure with lupins, but that's a thing of the past now. But when it does not nodulate, it looks yellow like that. So the nitrogen factory doesn't function without the right rhizobia. Same within peas. This is Ron Yates again. We have the same issue with pea rhizobia. This is no nitrogen, no rhizobia in peas. This is peas with a good inoculant strain on a difficult soil. Now, we also, because we wanted to start experimenting with sowing our legumes in summer when the soil's 70 degrees temperature, we wanted to develop some inoculant carriers, some ways to protect the rhizobia in those hot soils. So we spent quite a bit of time developing this dry clay granule that we can impregnate with rhizobia, and if we use those granules as the inoculant, we can put them into dry soils. And this is quite an important technological innovation that goes along with Brad's talk about summer sowing. So you will have seen inoculants as peat that you put on seeds. Sometimes you coat them with lime so they don't stick together. And some peat can be prilled into granules like this that are moist, but the important one for us are these dry clay granules based on bentonite, and they can keep Rhizobium alive for 12 months in dry soils. And through those technological innovations, through the development of the hard-seeded annual legumes and the better inoculants and the better ways to sow the inoculants, we've got systems now that can serve that purpose that we originally strove for in 1993. We've got legumes that are cheap to produce, cheap to sow, resilient, well adapted to our poor soils. So here is Rhizobium coming out of a canola stubble, and this is coming out of 3 crops in a row. So before this there was probably wheat or barley, I'm not sure. Wheat, barley, canola. Rhizobium emerging from its hard seed bank. So we've got those legumes in place now, and if we've got them on the right soil type, they look like this. But we find with the pasture legumes, they're well adapted to certain niches. So we'd have the medics on the neutral pH fine textured soils, bladder clover on slightly more acid versions of that, Rhizobium on acid sandy versions of that, and then the Ceradella on the sandy soil. So it's the right legume in the right place in the right farming system. So here's Rhizobium, which is one of my pets. I really like it, so I'll show lots of pictures. Now I just wanted to come back in and give you a couple of minutes on the herbicide issue here. But before I do that, I'm going to show you something. This year in Western Australia, we had good early rains. The rains began in April, and 5 weeks after that, in early May, this was the regenerating Rhizobium at a place called Ardath, which is in one of those 250 millimetre rainfall zones. So this is the amount of pasture on the ground in May in a Mediterranean system when we got a good shower of rain in April and the plant was able to get through the following dry spells and proliferate. Now, this is unbelievably important for these farmers who can now get all their crop nitrogen needs next year from this pasture. So we're having farmers who were putting no nitrogen on their crops after a legume like this. Okay? Now that legume only works if we've treated the soil properly. I'm going to give you a quick example of the hazards ahead of us with the herbicide use. So Secura, it's one that you guys are using. We tend to forget about plant back. So if you're using Secura in a cereal, there's a 9-month plant back period for these legumes, 9-month plant back, or 250 millimetres of rain. So if you're farming where we were yesterday, you've got a whole year before you can plant back after Secura, plant back your legumes. And even for some of the more, or for lucerne and durum wheat sensitive, it's a 21-month plant back, or 550 millimetres of rain. And this is the fine print on the labels of some of these herbicides. You've got to be very careful. And if you're not careful, this is what happens. This is an experiment that Brad and his team did. This is done in punnets of soil with 7 different pasture legumes, okay, using very, very small applications of trisulfuron, okay? trisulfuron at 1/10 of the label rate, 1/100th of the label rate, 1,000th, a 10,000th, 100,000ths of the label rate. So that's not much. I mean, the label rate's 30 grams per hectare, I think. So 100,000ths of that isn't much trisulfuron, is it? So without any herbicide present on those 7 legumes, you get, this is the growth you get after 18 days. But with a slight residual, look at Bizarula down here. My baby, my lovely plant. That's it without any residual or any trisulfuron. This is it with just a sniff. Okay? And when there's more than a sniff, it's gone completely. Even Angel, which is the one that's tolerant of the SUs, still is affected by some residuals. But many of the legumes, this is subclover, you need very little residual to affect growth. Now this is growth expressed in a really decent pot, watered and quite happy. If you dig the plants up and look at the roots, this is what's gone wrong. Here's your control, okay? 100,000ths of the recommended rate of trisulfuron has knocked off the roots, the root hairs, it's failed to nodulate, and that's giving you this. So that's this row here, okay? It looks sort of okay above ground. Below ground, it's looking like this. It's going to have trouble. And then with the higher residual rates, you get complete root pruning, no root hairs, no nodules. So these low levels of residuals are a real worry for anyone who wants to grow legumes. We ran a bigger experiment a couple of years ago with the clover, with these herbicides, okay? You can see these herbicides. Here's the control, 3 reps, 1, 2, 3. Here's the control, okay? So these were applied at label rates in the cereal crop. We then took the next May, so the following season, after the plant back, we took cores out and watered them up in the glasshouse and looked at how they grew, and look at the retarding of growth from the residuals of herbicides applied at label rates in the right way, in the right crop, at the right time. Even if you follow the label rates, we have got these impacts on clover nodulation and growth. And this is one of the main reasons legumes are disappearing out of our rotations, because we haven't taken enough notice of the long-term effects of these herbicides. So this is a big, big lesson for us. And our farmers now, we say, if you're going to grow legumes, avoid SUs and be careful about what else you put on. And I've just reiterated that picture there in your minds. So herbicides are a major threat to the success of legumes. So some herbicides, not all, but just bear that in mind. Now, Brad's going to talk about other ways of sowing these legumes that fit neatly into our labour windows. And the point to take from Brad's presentation will be how much valuable it is to have your legumes growing at the start of the season when it's warm and moist. And that's summer sowing, and he's going to talk about that. And he's going to talk about the scientific challenges, and they're serious technical challenges, but we've overcome them. Yeah. Now, lastly, how am I going? Oh, that's 6 minutes. I'll go slow. So we've still got the passion of improving the legumes we use in our farming systems. We haven't got legumes for all soils, and we have this emerging challenge of climate variability. And in Western Australia, it's hitting us at the beginning of the season, April, May, and it's hitting us at the critical time for maturity of our legumes. That's September, October. So it's actually threatening the seed set out of the annual legumes I've just been talking about. So if you're looking forward, if we're projecting forward 20 or 30 years, the way our climate's varying, it's impacting on our annual cycle, our annual plant cycle. Our May to September isn't as honest in rainfall as it once was. So the challenge we've set ourselves is to look for perennial legumes right? So those are legumes that stay in the ground all year round for 3 or 4 years, like shrubs. And they are less affected by climate variability, believe it or not. So you saw my life pictures before about the Mediterranean basin, where we got most of our hard-seeded annual legumes. And this is what the Mediterranean basin looks like in summer. There isn't many, if any, green plants. And I knew there's no point going there to look for our perennial legumes that we wanted to do in the next phase of development. So where do we go? We came here. About 10 years ago, no, a bit longer actually, we thought about this little Mediterranean section you've got over here in the southern and western Cape. And I'd actually thought about this in the 90s, and I talked to a guy that had been here, and he said, John, it's a complete waste of time going there. There's no plants that are going to be of interest to you. So I didn't do it. But I did send teams all around the world, Turkmenistan, North America, Mexico. But I came here. I wanted to have a look. And you've got to be careful here. You can't just get out of the car, can you? And go for a walk in the paddock, because things can happen. You've got to be a little bit savvy and careful, else you end up like that. But fortunately, I've had some great colleagues help me here, and I really need friends here because I do get nervous wandering around South Africa on my own. Some of the colleagues, this is a picture of Stephen Boatwright, and this is early summer 10 years ago. This is Collie Lowe, I think, who's up at Newartville. So we came and looked at your sands. We had a big education. This was all new to us, but you've got such a wealth of your own perennial herbaceous legumes that your animals can eat, merinos can eat. We've got, as I said at the beginning, lots of legumes too, but they're poisonous. And you've got some pretty poor soils, which we like. So we've done a little bit of a hunt around your country for the next suite of plants we'd like to domesticate. And this one that Collie's kneeling in is Lebbeckia ambigua. We didn't know what it was at the time, but we know now what it is. And importantly for us, this is a fence down the middle of one of his fields. This is granite at the surface. This is where he's had stock, this is where he hasn't, so it's pretty clear the stock eat the plant, which is quite important to us. We're not interested in plants that animals can't eat. Got plenty of those ourselves. The bacteria associated with those Lebbeckia species are absolutely unique, and we got to name them. So we named one after Janet Sprent, who's a famous legume scientist. We named one after Dilworth, who's a guy that I worked with and who was one of my early mentors. And through the use of the seeds and the bacteria appropriately, we've introduced Lebbeckia now to some of our terrific sandy soils. And this is a picture taken after the plant had been there for about 18 months. And I just wanted to show you the soil type we're talking about. It's pretty poor. But we have about 10% of our state with soils like this, on which we can grow nothing. And they're non-wetting on the surface, but the water does accumulate down here and stays there all summer. And if we don't use that water, it moves under the land and comes up in the lower parts of the landscape and brings salt with it. So we call these recharge areas for salinity, and we need to get rid of that water. And this is a plant that will go down 2 or 3 metres and do that. So we're in the process of domesticating this plant, and don't be worried, because if it works, we give it back to you for free, but we use it in Western Australia for free as well. But having looked around here, since you're growing all of our stuff anyway, I don't think there should be any worry about it. There and back, we're giving you trees and medics and lots of things. So you've given us this, thank you very much, and that's where we're going with our research over the next few years to see if we can turn it into a useful plant for these poor soils. And I'm finished. So I wanted to say a big thank you to all my people. CRS is a Centre for Rhizobium Studies at Murdoch University. That's our logo. That's our free end farming logo. They're nodules. Johan's been a fantastic host, and I thank you so much for inviting Brad and I here, for looking after us so in such a special way, driving us around, opening our eyes. We've learnt quite a bit while we've been here, and my university. So thanks very much.